Okay, so we're going to talk briefly now about the Bohr shift. Now, the Bohr shift's a fairly popular exam question, and what they'll tend to do is they'll probably tend to do something like show you the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve graph, and then ask you about what changes you might expect to take place as a result of exercise. They also might ask you what happens as part of the Bohr shift. So we'll talk briefly about that now and go through it. So as you exercise, what tends to happen then within the muscles is the partial pressure of oxygen within the muscles is going to go down. The reason partial pressure of oxygen in the muscles goes down is fairly obvious. It's because the muscles are using up that oxygen. So your internal respiration's taking place and you are using up the oxygen, and so there's not as much left over as what there would have been at rest. So you have a very low partial pressure of oxygen in the muscles, about 15 millimeters of mercury versus about 40 at rest. Now, that in itself means that there's going to be a lot of oxygen being given up by your hemoglobin, so disassociating from your hemoglobin and making its way into the muscle. Now, we learned before that actually when you're exercising, about 75% of the oxygen that your hemoglobin was carrying is disassociated, so it's given up by that hemoglobin and it enters the muscle tissue so that it can be used, meaning you've only got about 25% left. There are some other things though as part of the Bohr shift that come into play, and there's three things that you need to be aware of that you'll need to know. So the first thing is temperature. So as your temperature increases, your hemoglobin, for want of a better word, becomes less attracted to the oxygen. So I guess you could say less sticky. The oxygen doesn't want to stick to it quite as keenly, and so it's going to give it up that little bit more easily. Okay. And that will happen basically at body temperature of about 39 degrees. Your normal resting body temperature is about 37 degrees, something like that. When you start exercising or start warming up, your body temperature will increase. Once it gets up to about 39 degrees, the hemoglobin is not quite as sticky, it's not quite as attracted to the oxygen as it was before, and so it's going to allow that oxygen to dissociate just that little bit more easily. And give it up a little bit faster into the muscle tissues. The next thing that's happening is that obviously during exercise you are producing a lot higher quantity of carbon dioxide than you were at rest, and because you've got increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the muscles, that's also going to help the oxygen to disassociate that little bit faster into the muscles. If you think back to what we looked at when we looked at partial pressures last time, obviously the gas likes to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So if you think of a muscle that's now got vast quantities of carbon dioxide in it and very, very little oxygen in it, when the oxygenated blood arrives from the lungs, there's very, very high partial pressure of oxygen within it. That oxygen wants to be given up really, really quickly and make its way across into the muscle. So that's the second thing that we need to know. The third and final thing we need to know is that during exercise, the blood becomes more acidic. Okay, so that means it has a lower pH. So a lower pH means, again, that the hemoglobin is less sticky, it's less attracted to the oxygen, and it will give it up that little bit more easily into the muscles. Lactic acid and carbon dioxide, lactic acid is obviously produced during exercise, as is carbon dioxide, which can turn into carbonic acid within your blood. So they're the things that are sort of working to lower the pH of the blood when you're exercising. So just to recap, the three things that change is you get an increase in temperature, you get increased production of carbon dioxide, and you get increased blood acidity levels, so a lower pH in the blood. And those three things combined mean that the hemoglobin is much more likely to give up its oxygen. It's going to allow the oxygen to disassociate more readily than it would during rest. In fact, because of those three things combined, you give up about 15% more oxygen than you would have done at rest. Okay, so moving on then and looking at what happens to the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve during recovery. So this time we're going to focus on the graph on the right hand side. We're first of all going to mention the fact that during recovery the S-shaped curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so during exercise it shifted to the right. During recovery, it's going to move back towards the left. Now, why is that important for us? One of the reasons it's important for us is that actually, during exercise, if we follow that S-shaped curve up, the right-hand side one, showing what's happening during exercise, we can see that at the lungs, we're no longer getting 100% saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. There's a little bit of a gap there. Okay, now during recovery we really could do with 100% saturation because that's going to help us to recover that little bit faster. So because the hemoglobin's less sticky, for want of a better word, during exercise, we end up with not getting 100% saturation anymore. What happens during recovery then is we're going to start to get pH coming back up. That's because we're no longer producing as much lactic acid or carbon dioxide, so not as much carbonic acid. We're going to get lower levels of carbon dioxide during recovery because we're not producing the waste products, because respiration's not taking place quite as intensely as it was before, and our temperature is going to start to come back down as well. Now, those three things changing again mean that your hemoglobin is going to start to dissociate from oxygen less easily. It means it's going to be more sticky, more attracted to the oxygen than it was during exercise. Okay, so during recovery, it means that that S-shaped curve is going to move towards the left-hand side and it's going to kind of shift back into the position that it should be in.